New York City, 1931. The night is thick with smoke and ambition. Somewhere between the neon hum of Times Square and the silent docks of the Hudson, a man sits in the back of a Cadillac, his cigarette burning slow, his mind sharper than any blade in the city. His name is Charles Lucky Luciano, a name that would soon become synonymous with control itself. This isn't the story of a gangster. It's the story of an engineer of chaos, a man who looked at a world of violence and disorder and saw opportunity. While others fought for scraps of power, Luciano envisioned something entirely new. A system, a structure, an empire built not on impulse but on intelligence. He didn't rule through fear alone. He ruled through design. The America of Luciano's youth was a nation of contradictions. On the surface, the roaring 20s promised freedom and wealth. Underneath, corruption and crime grew like ivy through the cracks of law and morality. Prohibition had turned the underworld into a marketplace. Every corner had a price. Every handshake carried risk. The old-world Mafia families, still bound by Sicilian blood codes and pride, were tearing each other apart, fighting over territory, honor, and revenge. And then came Luciano, the immigrant boy who watched from the streets and learned the rules faster than anyone else. He saw that chaos could be organized, that loyalty could be bought, that brutality could be disguised as business. His genius wasn't in violence, it was in restraint. He understood what few men in his world ever could, that real power is invisible. This film isn't about the crimes he committed, the bootlegging, the racketeering, the network of vice that made him a legend. It's about the psychology behind it, the art of manipulation, the science of control, and the quiet confidence that turned a street hustler into the architect of the modern mafia. We'll move through the decades, from the dirt alleys of the Lower East Side to the boardrooms of organized crime. We'll see how a man once dismissed as just another thug became a symbol of authority so powerful that even the law, at times, had to negotiate with him. Because in the story of Lucky Luciano, control wasn't just a means to survive, it was the entire game. And this, right here, is where that story begins, in the dim light of a city that never sleeps, with a man who taught the world's criminals how to think like kings. Before Lucky Luciano rose to power, the American underworld was a battlefield without structure, a storm of greed, pride, and blood that seemed endless. In the early decades of the 20th century, the Mafia in America was less an organization and more a scattered collection of gangs. Each operated by its own rules, often inherited from Sicily's rigid traditions. A world obsessed with honor, revenge, and absolute loyalty to one's family, not to logic. The streets of New York were divided like a map of small fiefdoms. The 5 Points gang ran pickpocket crews and protection rackets downtown. Italian families in Harlem fought Irish bootleggers in the Bronx. Jewish syndicates ran gambling dens and speakeasies in Brooklyn, while remnants of Tammany Hall, corrupt politicians and police, looked the other way for a cut of the profits. Violence was constant, not strategic. Murders were messages, not maneuvers. Everyone wanted to be king, but no one understood how to build a kingdom. Prohibition changed everything. When the Volstead Act outlawed alcohol in 1920, it didn't end drinking, it created an underground economy worth billions. Suddenly, liquor became liquid gold, and the gangs became business operators overnight. But with wealth came war. Truck hijackings, assassinations, betrayals. Every shipment of whiskey from Canada or rum from the Caribbean could spark another feud. The streets ran red with ambition. For the old Sicilian bosses, this new world was terrifying. Men like Joe Masuria and Salvatore Maranzano believed in the old rules, La Famiglia, the secret code of Omerta, and absolute dominance by force. But America was different. It wasn't Sicily. Here, power wasn't inherited, it was taken. Immigrant gangs competed not just with one another, but with political machines, union bosses, and law enforcement. The city was turning modern, and the old ways, knives, oaths, vendettas, were becoming obsolete. Meanwhile, the immigrant communities were bursting at the seams. Italian families crowded into tenements, trying to survive in a society that treated them as outsiders. Poverty, discrimination, and corruption created a world where crime wasn't just temptation, it was survival. Young boys watched gangsters in sharp suits with fedoras and Cadillacs, and they understood the message. In America, respect wasn't given, it was taken by force or finesse. But there was no unifying force. No single mind capable of seeing beyond the chaos. Each gang lord was a dictator within his small empire, suspicious of outsiders and jealous of power. If one man grew too strong, the others plotted against him. The result was constant instability, an ecosystem of paranoia. Even law enforcement was lost in the maze. Police precincts were bribed, judges intimidated, and prosecutors easily corrupted. The press sensationalized mob violence, feeding public fascination with gangsters while doing little to curb their power. The government didn't yet understand organized crime because, truthfully, it wasn't organized. This was the fractured world into which Lucky Luciano would step, a world begging for order but too blind to create it. He saw what others couldn't, the inefficiency of chaos, the waste of endless wars. He understood that for all their talk of honor, these men were losing money and blood over pride. To him, power wasn't about reputation, it was about results. Luciano looked around and saw that America itself was changing. Cities expanding, industries booming, money flowing through every corridor of corruption. He recognized that the Mafia could mirror that system, not fight it. Crime could be industrialized. Violence could be strategic. Profit could be shared, and peace, however temporary, could be profitable. Before Luciano, no one thought this way. The Mafia was emotional, reactive, tribal. After him, it became organized, logical, and terrifyingly efficient. But in the early 1920s, that future was still invisible. The streets of New York remained a symphony of gunfire and ambition. Every man for himself, every family guarding its corner. And in that chaos, a young, streetwise Sicilian named Charlie. Before he was Lucky, he was simply Salvatore Lucania, a small, wiry boy born in 1897 in Lercara Fritti, Sicily. His father, a sulfur miner, dreamed of a better life across the Atlantic. In 1906, the Lucania family joined the flood of immigrants sailing to America, arriving at Ellis Island with nothing but hope and exhaustion. They settled in Manhattan's Lower East Side, a world of cramped tenements, overcrowded streets, and endless struggle. It was a neighborhood where every language was foreign, every corner had a hustle, and survival meant learning the rules fast. The Lower East Side was a paradox, both cradle and crucible. Children played stickball next to drunks, preachers, and pickpockets. Street vendors shouted over the rattle of trolley cars. The air smelled of bread, sweat, and dreams. It was here that young Charlie learned his first lessons about power, that strength wasn't just about fists but about perception. Those who looked confident, who could talk fast, who could make others believe they had control, they survived. At school, Lucania was restless and ambitious. He didn't like taking orders, especially from teachers who mocked his accent or his patched clothes. By the time he was 14, he dropped out. The streets became his classroom and crime became his curriculum. He started small, running errands for local gangsters, collecting protection money from shopkeepers, and ferrying stolen goods across the neighborhood. But Charlie had something that set him apart from the other street kids: charm. Even at a young age, he was disarming. He spoke with confidence, carried himself like someone older, and knew how to make people feel important. It was a trait that would serve him for life. He wasn't the toughest kid on the block, but he was the one everyone wanted on their side. His early years brought him into contact with the 5 Points Gang, one of the most notorious street gangs in New York, a melting pot of Italian and Jewish criminals who would later give rise to many of America's most infamous mobsters. There he met two names that would shape his destiny: Meyer Lansky and Benjamin Bugsy Siegel. Lansky was a genius with numbers, calm and methodical. Siegel was volatile, fearless, and charismatic. Together, they formed a trio that would redefine what it meant to be a gangster in America. Charlie's ambitions grew alongside his reputation. He began organizing small gambling operations, selling protection to young gamblers and pimps, and eventually running bootleg liquor during Prohibition. Every deal, every betrayal, every narrow escape became another page in his self-taught manual of power. He learned that money wasn't just wealth, it was leverage. And loyalty wasn't given, it was managed. By his early 20s, he'd already earned the nickname Lucky. The origin of the name remains debated. Some say it came from his uncanny ability to survive assassination attempts. Others claim it was for his lucky streak in gambling, or perhaps simply his charisma that seemed to draw fortune to him. Whatever the reason, the name fit. Lucky Luciano sounded like a man who couldn't lose, a man destined to rise. But his luck wasn't mystical. It was calculated. Luciano understood risk like a chess player understands sacrifice. When he was beaten and left for dead by rival gangsters, slashed across the face and throat in a deal gone wrong, he didn't retreat. He came back harder, colder, more focused. The scars across his right cheek became a permanent reminder. In this world, survival wasn't about luck at all, it was about control. As the 1920s roared, Luciano climbed from street hustler to lieutenant in Joe Masuria's criminal empire. He wore custom suits now, smoked expensive cigars and dined with politicians and gangsters alike. But deep inside he was still studying, watching how men of power behaved, how they fell and why. He noticed that most bosses ruled through fear, and fear, he realized, was fragile. The moment people stopped being afraid, power dissolved. Luciano wanted something different, a kind of respect that didn't need to be shouted. He began to develop his own philosophy, that power was most effective when it appeared effortless. The man who controlled others wasn't the loudest or the most violent. He was the calm center of the storm, the one who could make others believe they were acting freely when in truth they were following his design. This was the birth of the modern Luciano, not just a gangster but a strategist. He began to see the Mafia not as a family bound by blood, but as a corporation bound by profit. The codes of Sicily, the emotional wars, the ancient grudges, all of it seemed primitive to him. America was modern, industrial, fast-moving. To survive here, crime had to evolve. In those years, Luciano was laying the foundation for everything that would follow. His alliances, his betrayals, his empire. But it all began with that boy from the Lower East Side, the one who refused to be defined by poverty or tradition. In a world where most men were pawns, Lucky Luciano was quietly teaching himself how to become the player who moved the pieces. By the early 1920s, New York City was a living organism, pulsing with ambition, vice, and opportunity. Prohibition had turned every alleyway into a potential gold mine, and every gangster into an entrepreneur. For a young and hungry Lucky Luciano, this chaotic new world was both a classroom and a testing ground. He had already earned a reputation as a sharp dresser, a fast talker, and a man who could be trusted to make a deal stick. But beneath the charm was calculation. Luciano was studying, watching every powerful figure around him, learning not just how to make money but how to hold power. The streets introduced him to a hierarchy that functioned like a dark mirror of legitimate business. There were bosses, middlemen, and laborers. Each rung on the ladder had its risks, and Luciano climbed them with deliberate precision. He started running liquor shipments for Joe, the boss Mafia, one of the city's most feared mafia leaders. Mafia ruled his criminal network the old Sicilian way, through intimidation and loyalty sealed in blood. But Luciano quickly noticed the cracks. The old man was stubborn, superstitious, and suspicious of anyone who didn't speak his dialect or follow his customs. For all his muscle, Mafia's operation was inefficient, weighed down by pride and paranoia. Luciano's true education came not from Mafia, but from the company he kept outside the traditional mafia. He moved freely between worlds, befriending Jewish gangsters like Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel, Irish bootleggers, and corrupt union bosses. Where old-school mobsters saw outsiders, Luciano saw opportunity. He admired Lansky's mathematical mind, how the young Jewish kid could calculate odds, profits, and risk with surgical precision. Siegel, meanwhile, had the boldness to act on instinct, the kind of fearless aggression that could turn an idea into a fortune overnight. Together, the trio began running operations that crossed ethnic and territorial lines, a revolutionary concept at the time. Luciano realized that crime, like business, thrived on collaboration, not division. The idea of working with non-Italians was blasphemy to the old dons, but to Luciano it was the future. Profit had no language, no flag. His network expanded through the nightlife of Manhattan. Speakeasies disguised as jazz clubs, gambling parlors behind barbershops, and brothels tucked away in uptown apartments. Luciano managed these ventures like a businessman. He calculated demand, minimized conflict, and ensured that everyone, from cops to couriers, got their cut. Violence, in his mind, was a failure of negotiation. He didn't avoid it, but he used it sparingly, with precision. When he ordered a hit, it was because diplomacy had failed, not because of emotion. That discipline set him apart. He wasn't a hothead, nor a sentimentalist. He could smile at a man one night and have him removed the next if it protected the enterprise. But even in ruthlessness there was logic. To Luciano, violence without purpose was wasteful, and waste was weakness. He learned this lesson the hard way. In 1929, Luciano was kidnapped and nearly killed by unknown assailants, possibly linked to rival gangs. He was beaten, stabbed, and left for dead on Staten Island. But he survived. When he reappeared, his face scarred and his voice lower, the transformation was complete. He was no longer just Charlie Lucania from the Lower East Side. He was Lucky Luciano, reborn, refined, and dangerous. After that, he approached the game differently. The attack taught him that survival depended not on loyalty but on control, and control required vision. He began to distance himself from Mafia's outdated leadership and quietly built his own alliances with younger, more progressive figures like Frank Costello, Vito Genovese, and Lansky. These men shared his hunger for modernization. They weren't gangsters in the old sense. They were businessmen in tailored suits who happened to operate in the shadows. Costello became Luciano's political liaison, the man who could bribe judges and buy protection from City Hall. Genovese handled enforcement, the muscle behind Luciano's strategy. Lansky handled money, laundering, investing, and expanding into gambling operations that stretched from New York to Havana. Each man played his role, and Luciano orchestrated them like a conductor. He wasn't the loudest voice in the room, but every move, every meeting carried his invisible signature. Luciano also learned how to manipulate perception. He dressed impeccably, spoke with confidence, and moved through high society with ease. To the police he appeared as a businessman. To rival gangs he appeared as a partner. To his enemies he was a ghost, unpredictable and untouchable. He cultivated an aura of control that made people underestimate his ambition. Behind the scenes, Luciano was building a new kind of empire, one that would outlast its founders. He saw the criminal world not as a series of disconnected gangs but as a corporate structure that could be unified under one system, one set of rules. He wanted to replace feuds with contracts, vendettas with profits, and chaos with order. His philosophy was simple yet revolutionary: make money first, settle scores later. While the old bosses obsessed over pride and lineage, Luciano focused on efficiency and results. This mindset would become his weapon, and ultimately his legacy. By the end of the 1920s, Luciano was no longer just an apprentice. He was a visionary in a world that still didn't understand what he was building. He had studied every angle: the psychology of loyalty, the economics of vice, and the power of perception. Now he was ready to apply those lessons on a scale no one in the criminal world had ever dared to imagine. The game had taught him everything, now it was time to rewrite the rules. By 1930, Lucky Luciano had become something more than a gangster. He was an observer of chaos, a man who could walk through blood and see patterns where others saw only violence. The Mafia, as it existed then, was a machine built on emotion. Bosses ruled by instinct and tradition, bound to codes that made sense in Sicily but not in the roaring modern chaos of America. To Luciano, that world felt ancient, clumsy, and doomed. He wanted to replace it with something far more sophisticated, a structure that would turn street crime into a lasting institution. In his mind, power was a form of architecture. Every empire, whether legal or criminal, needed foundations: rules, order, and hierarchy. Without those, even the strongest boss would eventually fall. He watched men like Joe, the boss, Masuria, and Salvatore Maranzano destroy themselves in endless feuds. To him, they were generals fighting wars that no longer mattered. Luciano believed the Mafia's future wasn't in domination by one man, but in balance between many. He once described his philosophy in simple terms: there's enough for everybody, if you know how to share. It wasn't generosity, it was strategy. If everyone profited, no one would have a reason to revolt. By distributing wealth and influence among the families, he could maintain control without constant bloodshed. Order, not fear, would become the glue that held the underworld together. Luciano's vision was influenced by the America around him. The city's skyline was rising, skyscrapers of steel and glass replacing old tenements. Corporations were emerging as the new kings of capitalism, run by boards, executives, and systems rather than single tyrants. Why couldn't the Mafia operate the same way? He studied businessmen the way he once studied gangsters. He admired how banks, unions, and corporations thrived by rules and structures, by making their power appear legitimate. He began talking about the idea quietly among his closest allies: Frank Costello, Meyer Lansky, and Vito Genovese. Together, they imagined a criminal board of directors, a syndicate where every family had representation, disputes were settled by vote instead of bullets, and profits flowed through agreed-upon channels. To them, it wasn't fantasy, it was evolution. But before that vision could take shape, the old world had to collapse. At the time, the Mafia was torn apart by the Castellammarese War, a brutal civil conflict between the factions of Joe Masuria and Salvatore Maranzano. The war was a clash between two generations: the old Sicilian traditionalists and the new American-born gangsters who wanted change. For Luciano, it was the perfect storm, the moment when his ideas could rise from the ashes of bloodshed. He played both sides masterfully, pretending loyalty to Masuria while secretly negotiating with Maranzano. He studied both men like chess pieces. Masuria was paranoid, clinging to power through fear. Maranzano was cunning but arrogant, obsessed with Roman titles and medieval notions of hierarchy. Luciano saw in both men the same flaw: ego. Their pride blinded them to the future, and he was ready to remove them both. But his plan wasn't just about ambition, it was about transformation. Luciano understood that lasting power required legitimacy, even within illegitimacy. A stable organization meant less attention from law enforcement, fewer wars, and more money. It meant that the Mafia could integrate into American life so completely that people wouldn't even notice it was there. He envisioned the Mafia as an invisible empire, one that touched politics, business, and unions. Instead of standing against society, it would exist within it. Politicians could be bribed, labor unions controlled, contracts fixed, all without public bloodshed. The true genius of his vision was subtlety. Power that operated quietly, efficiently, almost bureaucratically. Luciano's mind worked like that of an engineer. He broke down the Mafia's inefficiencies and rebuilt them. Where others saw territory, he saw markets. Where others sought revenge, he sought profit. He understood that emotional decisions, vendettas, betrayals, reckless displays of violence, destroyed stability. A killing was only useful if it served a purpose. Every act, every alliance, every dollar had to fit into the system he was designing. He also began to reshape the internal culture. Omerta, the code of silence, remained sacred, but Luciano shifted its focus. It was no longer just about loyalty to one boss, it was loyalty to the system. If one man fell, the organization endured. He wanted soldiers to understand that they served something bigger than family pride. It was a radical redefinition of the Mafia's identity. His friends joked that he talked about the business the way Wall Street men talked about stocks. But that was the point. Luciano wanted to erase the line between organized crime and organized capitalism. Both were systems of control, both required hierarchy, trust, and shared profit. The only difference was legality. Behind his calm exterior, Luciano carried the quiet confidence of a man who knew where history was heading. He didn't need to scream for power, he was already shaping it. The New York underworld didn't yet realize it, but the boy from the Lower East Side was about to reinvent their world. He once told an associate, "You can't stop change, you can only decide how to use it." And in that single sentence lay the heart of his philosophy. Where others clung to the past, Luciano prepared for the future. Where others used guns, he used systems. Soon he would prove that even in the darkest corners of crime, order could be more terrifying and more effective than chaos ever was. By the dawn of the 1930s, the streets of New York were drowning in blood. What began as a battle for control between two aging Mafia titans, Joe the Boss Masuria and Salvatore Maranzano, had turned into a full-blown civil war. It was called the Castellamarese War, and for nearly 2 years it reduced the Italian underworld to ashes. Soldiers were gunned down in restaurants, alleys, and barber chairs. Loyalty was temporary, betrayal was currency. The city's newspapers called it a secret war no one can see, but to men like Lucky Luciano, it was an opportunity hiding in chaos. For Luciano, this war was more than a fight for dominance. It was a test of ideas, old world versus new. The traditional dons, steeped in Sicilian honor, fought over pride and heritage. Luciano, however, saw the conflict as a lesson in inefficiency. Every bullet fired meant lost business. Every funeral meant less money. In his mind, the Mafia's obsession with revenge was bad economics. He was done serving generals who couldn't see past their own egos. Joe Masuria had been Luciano's mentor and his captor, the boss who gave him opportunity but demanded total submission. The boss ruled like a tyrant, expecting tribute from every racket in the city. His orders were law, and questioning them meant death. But Luciano understood that Masuria's leadership was unsustainable. He ran the Mafia like a medieval fiefdom in a modern world. The old man's paranoia strangled innovation. His refusal to work with non-Italians kept profits small. And worst of all, he didn't trust Luciano, the one man trying to evolve the system. At the same time, Salvatore Maranzano, a more refined but equally ruthless Sicilian from Castellammare del Golfo, was rising as Masuria's rival. Maranzano was intelligent, methodical, and as steeped in tradition as Masuria, though in a different way. He styled himself after Julius Caesar, demanding that his men call him Capo di tutti capi, the boss of all bosses. He dreamed of reorganizing the Mafia, but only with himself at its pinnacle. To Luciano, this was still the same disease, power driven by ego, not structure. As the bodies piled up, Luciano began plotting something unthinkable. He would end the war not by choosing a side but by eliminating them both. He first aligned himself with Maranzano, pretending to defect from Masuria's camp. In secret meetings, he offered to betray his old boss in exchange for peace. Maranzano agreed, but Luciano's vision went far beyond betrayal. He wanted to destroy the entire hierarchy that made men like Masuria and Maranzano possible. On April 15, 1931, Luciano made his move. He invited Joe Masuria to a restaurant in Coney Island for what appeared to be a friendly lunch. As they played cards and shared wine, Luciano excused himself to the restroom. Within moments, 4 gunmen, Albert Anastasia, Vito Genovese, Joe Adonis and Bugsy Siegel, stormed the room and gunned down Masuria. When Luciano returned, his mentor lay dead across the table, his hands still clutching a deck of cards. The message was clear: the old world had been executed. For a brief moment, peace seemed possible. Maranzano became the new boss of bosses, and Luciano was rewarded for his loyalty. But he soon realized he had traded one dictator for another. Maranzano immediately began reorganizing the Mafia, establishing the 5 families of New York, an idea that actually came from Luciano himself. But the new boss poisoned that idea by placing himself above it. He instituted Roman titles, capos, soldiers, consiglieres, and demanded tributes like a feudal emperor. To Luciano, it was déjà vu. Maranzano's arrogance was more polished than Masuria's, but equally dangerous. The man read books on Roman history and modeled his leadership on Caesar, forgetting of course how Caesar ended. He ordered background checks on Luciano and his allies, even planning their murders to cement his control. But Luciano was always one step ahead. He'd learned from the streets that survival depended not on loyalty but on timing. If Maranzano planned to eliminate him, he would strike first, quietly, efficiently, and permanently. On September 10, 1931, Luciano set the trap. Disguising the hitmen as IRS agents, he sent his killers to Maranzano's office in the New York Central Building. The unsuspecting Don welcomed them in, expecting a tax inspection. Within seconds, the room turned silent. The supposed agents drew their weapons and stabbed Maranzano to death, the final echo of the old guard's rule. That day, the Mafia as it had existed for centuries, bound by heritage, ruled by fear, officially died. Luciano had destroyed both kings and claimed the throne, though he would never call himself boss of bosses. He understood that titles attracted bullets. His power was quieter, more sophisticated. He wanted the Mafia to function like a boardroom, not a monarchy. In the weeks that followed, Luciano gathered the most powerful figures of the underworld. Italian, Jewish, and Irish gangsters alike met in secret locations. For the first time, rivals sat at the same table. Out of those meetings, a new structure emerged: the Commission. To many it seemed like an overnight revolution. But in truth, it was the culmination of everything Luciano had learned, from his childhood on the Lower East Side to his rise through the ranks. He had watched the failures of old men who ruled by fear, and he had built something stronger: a democracy of crime, where money replaced bloodlines and negotiation replaced war. The Castellammarese War had left hundreds dead and the Mafia in ruins, but from that destruction, Luciano built a system that would define organized crime for decades. It wasn't just a victory of power, it was the triumph of intellect over tradition. When reporters later asked how he felt about betraying his mentors, Luciano simply smiled and said, "I didn't betray anybody. I changed the business." And in that moment he wasn't lying. The underworld had been reborn, not through violence alone but through vision. Lucky Luciano had ended an era and begun a new one, the era of organized crime as America's invisible empire. In the autumn of 1931, the smoke of the Castellammarese War still hung over New York City. Bodies had been buried, debts settled, and the last of the old bosses lay dead. But for Lucky Luciano this was not an ending, it was an opportunity to rebuild. Where others saw a battlefield littered with corpses, he saw a blank canvas. Out of chaos he would create order. Out of crime he would build a corporation. He understood that the Mafia could no longer function as a series of feuding families led by paranoid men. It needed to evolve into a system, a modern, disciplined structure that could survive beyond any one man's lifespan. To accomplish this, Luciano called for something unprecedented: a meeting of America's most powerful underworld figures. In late 1931, that meeting took place in a suite at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel. There were no bodyguards, no weapons on the table, just cigars, whiskey, and an air of tense curiosity. Seated before Luciano were representatives from every major Italian-American crime family in New York, as well as influential Jewish and Irish figures like Meyer Lansky, Frank Costello, and Dutch Schultz. The days of ethnic isolation were over. Luciano's empire would be built on collaboration, not division. He began by laying out his vision: a governing body that would oversee all mafia affairs, an organized council that could mediate disputes, allocate territories, and vote on major decisions. No more wars over pride. No more blood spilled for insults. From that day forward, every crime family would be a business partner. Profit, not revenge, would dictate their actions. This council would come to be known as the Commission. Luciano explained the rules clearly and without emotion. Each family would control its own territory and operations. No one man would ever again call himself Capo di Tutti Capi, the boss of all bosses. Instead, the commission would serve as a board of directors, where every major don had a voice. When disagreements arose, they would be settled by vote, not by bullets. If a family broke the peace, the others would unite to remove them. It was an elegant solution, one that reflected Luciano's genius for balance. He knew that men like Vito Genovese, Joe Bonanno, and Albert Anastasia would never willingly serve under another's rule. But if he could make them feel like equals while still keeping the reins in his hands, he could control the entire system without appearing to. The commission's structure was deceptively simple. The 5 families of New York, Luciano, Bonanno, Professai, Gagliano, and Mangano, formed the core. Beyond them, regional bosses from Chicago, Buffalo, and other major cities were granted representation. Every significant criminal operation in America, from bootlegging to labor racketeering, now fell under one umbrella. For the first time in history, organized crime was truly organized. Luciano positioned himself as the silent chairman. He didn't need to sit at the head of the table. His influence was embedded in the very architecture of the system. Meyer Lansky acted as his strategist and financial advisor, bridging connections to non-Italian syndicates. Frank Costello managed political and union relationships, ensuring that law enforcement and local politicians stayed compliant. And Vito Genovese, the ruthless enforcer, maintained discipline within the ranks. Under this new order, the Mafia began to resemble a legitimate business empire. They held annual meetings, recorded decisions, and even maintained unwritten bylaws. The commission wasn't about creating peace, it was about controlling violence. By regulating conflict, they made chaos profitable. Murders still happened, but now they were sanctioned, approved hits that served a purpose. Every death was a decision, not an accident. Luciano's greatest skill was making even his rivals feel like allies. He allowed others to believe they shared power, but behind the scenes, his influence was absolute. His calm, diplomatic demeanor earned him respect. He spoke softly, dressed immaculately, and handled negotiations like a Wall Street executive. Unlike the old dons who demanded fear, Luciano inspired efficiency. He also opened the door to an unprecedented alliance between Italian and Jewish crime syndicates. With Meyer Lansky, Bugsy Siegel, and others, Luciano expanded the commission's reach into gambling, narcotics, and international smuggling. Together, they established a criminal network that stretched from New York to Havana, from the docks of New Jersey to the casinos of Las Vegas. But the commission wasn't just about money, it was about philosophy. Luciano's new order had an unspoken creed: no emotion, no chaos, no noise. It was the art of invisible control. The less the public saw, the more powerful they became. Politicians could be bought quietly, judges bribed discreetly, and labor unions manipulated through influence rather than intimidation. Under Luciano's direction, the Mafia entered its golden age. Violence dropped, profits soared, and the organization embedded itself deeper into American life than ever before. Construction companies, restaurants, docks, unions, all became conduits of power. Legitimate businesses became fronts for laundering money, and illegal operations were run with corporate precision. Still, the balance was fragile. Luciano knew that power, even shared, was dangerous. The men around the table were not friends, they were predators in temporary truce. But he believed that by binding them together with profit, he could control their instincts. If everybody makes money, he once said, nobody wants to start trouble. What he created was revolutionary, not just for the underworld but for power itself. The commission became a template for organized systems of control, criminal or otherwise. It proved that structure could be more terrifying than chaos, and that the illusion of democracy could hide a single guiding hand. By 1933, as Prohibition came to an end, Luciano's empire had already diversified far beyond bootlegging. The Mafia controlled unions, infiltrated construction contracts, and expanded into narcotics. The commission had become a government within a government, invisible, untouchable, and remarkably efficient. It was the purest realization of Luciano's vision: a self-regulating machine where control wasn't loud or obvious, it was institutional. The Mafia no longer belonged to the past, it belonged to the modern world. In boardrooms and backrooms alike, Lucky Luciano had done the impossible. He had turned organized crime into an organization. By the early 1930s, the Mafia under Lucky Luciano's leadership had undergone a metamorphosis. What had once been a fragmented network of violent gangs had evolved into a disciplined, profit-driven syndicate, an empire built not on bloodlust but on business principles. Luciano wasn't just a criminal. He was an industrialist of the underworld. He saw the Mafia not as a gang, but as a corporation whose currency was fear and whose product was vice. The repeal of Prohibition in 1933 marked both a crisis and an opportunity. For over a decade, bootlegging had been the lifeblood of organized crime, filling the coffers of every major mobster in America. But as the taps reopened legally, a panic rippled through the underworld. The easy money was gone. Many bosses scrambled to find new rackets to replace the flood of alcohol revenue. Luciano, however, remained calm. He understood something the others didn't, that Prohibition had not created America's appetite for vice, it had merely revealed it. If one indulgence dried up, another could take its place. Luciano's mind worked like a strategist. He believed that crime should follow the same laws as economics, supply and demand. If the public wanted something society refused to sanction, gambling, drugs, prostitution, then there would always be profit to be made. The goal wasn't to fight moral laws but to exploit them. He called it servicing human weakness. Under the Commission's new structure, each family began to specialize in different revenue streams. Luciano and his inner circle diversified aggressively, expanding into labor racketeering, illegal gambling, loan sharking, and narcotics trafficking. Each racket was managed with business-like precision, complete with ledgers, enforcers, and accountants. Profits were shared, percentages recorded, and every major deal was approved through the Commission, a criminal version of corporate governance. Luciano's first major innovation came through labor racketeering. The Mafia began to infiltrate unions, especially those tied to construction, docks, and trucking. With Frank Costello's political connections, mob-backed union bosses became kingmakers in New York's labor world. They controlled strikes, work permits, and shipping schedules. Legitimate companies found that doing business without Mafia approval was impossible. Every contract came with a silent tax, a piece for the family. Through this system, the Mafia gained something it had never truly had before: legitimacy. Their hands were in the foundation of every building, every shipment unloaded on the docks, every deal signed in the backrooms of City Hall. Luciano's genius was in blurring the line between the criminal and the lawful, a gray zone where money cleansed its own sins. While Costello worked politics and unions, Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel focused on another frontier: gambling. From the streets of New York to the casinos of Havana, they built a transnational network of betting operations. Luciano didn't believe in street corner dice games. He believed in luxury. He wanted gambling dens that felt like private clubs, places where politicians, businessmen, and criminals could mingle without judgment. Money flowed in and respectability came with it. The real innovation, however, lay in international operations. With Lansky's financial genius, Luciano began expanding into Cuba and the Caribbean. The islands became safe havens for smuggling, laundering, and vice. Havana, with its nightclubs, brothels, and casinos, became the beating heart of Luciano's offshore empire. Later, this same network would lay the groundwork for what would become Las Vegas, the crown jewel of American organized crime. Then there was narcotics. Though officially banned by the Commission, at least publicly, the drug trade became one of Luciano's most profitable enterprises. He saw it as the future: compact, profitable, and difficult to trace. Through connections with Sicilian and French suppliers, Luciano helped develop the so-called French Connection, a transatlantic heroin pipeline that would dominate the global market for decades. To protect his image, he kept his hands clean, letting lower-tier figures handle distribution while he collected a silent percentage from the top. Luciano didn't just run rackets, he managed systems of control. His empire was built on efficiency and psychological discipline. Every man had a role. Every action had a reason. Violence wasn't forbidden, but it was rationalized, used only when necessary to preserve order. "You don't shoot a man for talking," he once said, "you shoot him for costing you money." Under this philosophy, the Mafia began functioning like a machine. Information flowed upward, money flowed downward, and loyalty flowed both ways. The system thrived on equilibrium, fear balanced with reward. Men who followed the rules were protected. those who didn't were erased. But the real brilliance of Luciano's structure lay in its invisibility. On paper he owned nothing. His name was absent from businesses, his fingerprints nowhere near criminal scenes. He cultivated an image of a refined gentleman, silk suits, tailored hats, quiet confidence. He dined at the Waldorf, played cards with senators and mingled with socialites. To the public he was just another successful Italian-American businessman. Behind the scenes he was the architect of the nation's underground economy. The press began calling him the man who ran New York. Judges, cops, and politicians all knew his influence but couldn't prove it. He didn't need to shout his power, it radiated in the silence he commanded. Luciano's true talent was not in brutality but in control without visibility, the art of domination through structure and psychology. As profits grew, so did his legend. The Mafia was now richer than ever, embedded in industries from shipping to construction, from entertainment to narcotics. It was no longer just a criminal network, it was a shadow economy parallel to America's own. Luciano had built what few could even imagine, a self-sustaining criminal ecosystem that operated with the precision of Wall Street and the discipline of the military. Yet beneath the surface, that very success carried its own dangers. The more money the Mafia made, the more attention it attracted. Federal agents began to notice patterns, mysterious payments, overlapping shell companies, and an unseen hierarchy directing everything from behind closed doors. And in the halls of New York's law enforcement, one name began to echo with growing intensity: Lucky Luciano. Luciano didn't know it yet, but his empire's greatest strength, its organization, would also become its greatest vulnerability. The very system he had built to protect himself was leaving fingerprints of its own, trails of paper, testimony, and whispers in the shadows. For now, though, Lucky Luciano stood at the pinnacle of power. He had turned crime into business, violence into management, and chaos into control. The world saw him as untouchable. And for a while he was. By the mid-1930s, Lucky Luciano's empire appeared unshakable. On the surface he was untouchable, a ghost wrapped in silk, a man who never signed a contract, never pulled a trigger, yet controlled the pulse of America's criminal underworld. He had turned the Mafia into a corporation, built alliances across ethnic lines, and perfected the art of invisible power. But beneath that calm surface the shadows were moving. What Luciano didn't yet know was that a war was coming, not from rival gangs but from the system itself. America was changing. The Great Depression had left the country bitter, desperate, and looking for scapegoats. Politicians were eager to show strength, reformers were rising, and the public's fascination with organized crime, fueled by newspaper headlines and Hollywood, had reached a boiling point. Gangsters were no longer seen as daring rebels, they were parasites draining a broken nation. And among the few who took that fight personally was a man named Thomas E. Dewey, a sharp, relentless prosecutor with a clean-cut face and the moral fury of a crusader. Dewey was everything Luciano wasn't: disciplined, public, and righteous to the point of obsession. Where Luciano ruled through silence, Dewey ruled through spectacle. And he had set his sights on the one man everyone said was beyond the law. Dewey understood that if he wanted to bring down Luciano, he couldn't attack him directly. There were no paper trails, no witnesses brave enough to testify, no evidence that tied him to the bloody realities of his empire. So Dewey went after what he could prove, the surface layer of Luciano's operation, the part that touched ordinary citizens: prostitution. Luciano's empire, like any large system, had its darker, dirtier components, rackets that operated in the shadows of the shadows. Prostitution was one of them. For years, vice dens across New York had paid protection money to the Mafia. While Luciano rarely touched the operation himself, his subordinates collected thousands weekly from brothel owners in exchange for safety. It was a simple arrangement, until Dewey's investigators began to pull at the threads. Using undercover agents and secret informants, Dewey's office began to map the network of brothels and madams linked to organized crime. Slowly the web led upward, through pimps, enforcers, and lieutenants, until the name Luciano appeared too many times to ignore. It wasn't a direct connection, but it was enough to build a story. Dewey didn't need to prove Luciano's guilt beyond doubt. He needed to make the public believe in it. Meanwhile, inside the Mafia, the balance of power was shifting. Vito Genovese, Luciano's ambitious underboss, was growing restless. He wanted more control, more money, more recognition. And though outwardly loyal, Genovese quietly began positioning himself as Luciano's potential successor. He fed information where it benefited him, manipulated alliances, and whispered doubts into the right ears. In an empire built on structure, ambition was the most dangerous contagion of all. But Luciano wasn't naive. He had survived too long to ignore the tremors beneath his feet. He tightened his circle, monitored meetings, and leaned on trusted allies like Meyer Lansky and Frank Costello to manage operations while keeping his own profile low. Yet even for a man as cautious as Luciano, there was no escaping the shifting tide of American law enforcement. In 1935, Dewey's investigations exploded into the public eye. Newspapers began printing sensational stories of vice rings and sex rackets, allegedly run by the Mafia. The idea that the same man who dined with politicians and businessmen also profited from prostitution made for perfect headlines. It wasn't about justice anymore, it was theater, and Dewey was the star. Luciano's name became front-page news. Reporters called him the Vice King of New York, the mastermind behind 1,000 brothels. Every headline chipped away at the myth of his invisibility. The man who had built his empire on control was now being defined by a story he couldn't control at all. Still, Luciano remained calm. "They can't touch me," he told Costello. "I don't own nothing, I don't run nothing." But Dewey didn't need ownership, he needed perception. In the court of public opinion, Lucky Luciano had already been convicted. Behind the scenes, Dewey was building his case brick by brick. He coerced testimonies from terrified prostitutes, offering them protection and anonymity. Some of them, desperate to escape jail, agreed to testify. The stories were exaggerated, sometimes contradictory, but they painted a vivid enough picture to convince a jury. Luciano's enemies within the underworld saw the danger and opportunity. Genovese, sensing the winds shifting, began distancing himself from Luciano's leadership, quietly securing his own safety. The commission meanwhile grew uneasy. A public trial could expose too much. For the first time since its creation, the Mafia's carefully maintained code of silence was threatened not by betrayal, but by visibility. Luciano, ever the strategist, considered fleeing. He had the means, safe houses in Florida, connections in Cuba. But pride stopped him. Running would make him look guilty, staying gave him the illusion of control. He underestimated Dewey's political hunger and the public's thirst for a villain. In February 1936, Luciano was arrested in a dramatic raid orchestrated by Dewey's office. The newspapers swarmed like vultures. Flashbulbs exploded as Luciano was led away in handcuffs, impeccably dressed but silent. It was a performance, the king brought low before the cameras. The Mafia world trembled. For years, Luciano had been the invisible hand guiding everything. Now that hand was in chains. The old order had been built on his mind. Without it, cracks began to form. Some families hesitated to move, unsure whether to protect him or move on. Others, like Genovese, quietly maneuvered for control. Yet even as he sat behind bars awaiting trial, Luciano exuded the same calm he always had. "They can lock me up," he told Lansky, "but they can't lock up what I built." He was right for now. The empire he created continued to function, a self-sustaining machine that obeyed his structure even without his presence. But what Luciano couldn't see from his cell was how quickly the winds of power were changing. The public loved Dewey's crusade. Newspapers hailed him as a hero who had brought down the nation's most powerful gangster. Politicians saw in him a rising star. The very system Luciano had manipulated for decades, judges, police, politicians, now turned against him in one orchestrated act of collective redemption. The hidden war was no longer between families or gangs. It was between perception and power, between the invisible and the exposed. And for the first time in his life, Lucky Luciano was losing control of the narrative. His empire still stood, but its architect was about to face his greatest test, one that couldn't be solved with bullets, bribes, or fear. The man who had built the modern mafia was about to meet the modern law. When the trial of Lucky Luciano began in May 1936, the world watched as the most powerful crime boss in America was dragged into the light. For years, Luciano had operated like a myth, a man so deeply buried beneath layers of loyalty, fear, and plausible deniability that no one could ever touch him. But now, under the glare of courtroom chandeliers and the clicking of 100 press cameras, he was no longer a ghost. He was a defendant, and Thomas E. Dewey was determined to make an example out of him. The courtroom became a theater of war. Dewey, sharp and deliberate, stood before the jury like a surgeon dissecting corruption itself. He spoke not just to the 12 men in the jury box, but to the entire nation. Every word was designed to pierce Luciano's carefully crafted mystique. He painted him not as a businessman, not as a silent kingpin, but as a leech, the man who had turned New York streets into a network of sin. The defendant, Dewey declared, pointing across the room, is the ruler of a vast prostitution syndicate, a man who profits from the degradation of women and the corruption of our city. It didn't matter that Luciano had never been caught running a brothel, or that he'd spent most of his nights in upscale restaurants and hotel suites far removed from the underworld's filth. In the court of public opinion, image mattered more than evidence. And Dewey's performance was masterful. Luciano's defense, led by attorney George Morton Levy, tried to dismantle the prosecution's case. He argued that Dewey's witnesses, a parade of prostitutes, pimps, and informants, were unreliable, coerced, and desperate to save themselves. Most had changed their stories multiple times. Some had never even met Luciano. "You're convicting a man," Levy thundered, "not on proof but on fear, the fear of the myth you've created." But Dewey didn't need proof. He needed belief. One by one, witnesses described the shadowy network of payments, enforcers, and protection fees that flowed upward, always upward, until the money reached the name everyone knew, even if they'd never seen him. Lucky, they called him. The man who never showed his face but whose permission was required for everything. Outside the courthouse, the spectacle grew. Crowds gathered daily, shouting at the motorcades, clutching newspapers with headlines that screamed, "Vice King on trial." To the public, the story was simple: a moral battle between a clean-cut crusader and a corrupt underworld tyrant. It was good versus evil, and America had already chosen sides. Inside, Luciano sat still, composed, often expressionless. He wore tailored suits, smoked calmly, and whispered to his lawyers in low tones. His restraint frustrated reporters. They wanted the drama of an outburst, a confession, a flash of guilt. But Lucky gave them nothing. His silence was his last weapon, a reminder that even here he refused to play by anyone else's rules. Yet beneath that cool exterior, Luciano understood what was happening. This wasn't a trial about evidence. It was about symbolism. Dewey was building a political career on his conviction. The government wanted a victory. The system needed a scapegoat to restore its own credibility after years of corruption. And Luciano, the man who had manipulated that system better than anyone, was the perfect target. The witnesses were the prosecution's ammunition. The most famous of them was a woman named Cokie Flo, a madam whose testimony became the emotional centerpiece of Dewey's case. Her account was inconsistent, exaggerated, even absurd in places, but it didn't matter. She told the story the public wanted to hear, of a powerful man who ruled vice from a distance, using fear and flattery to control the city's flesh trade. Dewey leaned on her words like gospel. Luciano's defense countered with witnesses of their own, including businessmen and politicians who vouched for his character. They tried to present him as a legitimate entrepreneur unfairly maligned by ambitious lawmen. But the tide was too strong. Each day, the newspapers printed Dewey's speeches in full and summarized the defense in a single dismissive paragraph. The verdict was being written outside the courtroom. By late June, after weeks of testimony, the jury retired to deliberate. They were gone less than 10 hours. When they returned, the foreman's voice cut through the silence like a blade: "Guilty on 62 counts of compulsory prostitution." Luciano didn't flinch. He didn't speak. His lawyers whispered, reporters gasped, and Dewey allowed himself the faintest smile. The judge sentenced Lucky Luciano to 30 to 50 years in prison, the harshest penalty ever given for a vice-related conviction in New York's history. The courtroom erupted in chaos. Some of Luciano's associates broke down in tears. Others cursed the judge under their breath. But Lucky simply stood, nodded once to his lawyers, and allowed the officers to handcuff him. As he was led away, a reporter shouted, "Lucky, any last words?" Luciano paused, looked over his shoulder, and said quietly, "I'll be all right. Tell Dewey he's got the wrong guy." That quote would echo through newspapers for weeks, half denial, half prophecy. For Thomas Dewey, the victory was monumental. Overnight, he became a national hero, the man who had done what no one else dared. His face appeared on magazine covers, and whispers of a political future began immediately. For Lucky Luciano, the conviction marked the beginning of exile from his own empire. The man who had built the commission, who had controlled the pulse of the underworld from the shadows, was now locked behind bars in Dannemora prison, a fortress in the cold northern hills of New York, known as Little Siberia. Inside, Luciano's world shrank from city blocks to steel bars. For the first time in his adult life, he was not the one giving orders. The empire he'd built continued without him, guided by men he had once mentored, Lansky, Costello, Genovese. But he knew that power without proximity was fragile. He could no longer read faces, sense shifting loyalties, or control decisions with a look. Still, Luciano refused to see his imprisonment as defeat. To him, it was just another battlefield, a different kind of control. "You can't kill an idea," he told one visitor. "You can only lock up the man who thought of it." And deep down he was right. His structure, his system, the commission, the rackets, the code, all continued to function like a living organism. He had built something that could outlast him, maybe even outlive him. But outside those prison walls, the balance of the underworld was already shifting. Vito Genovese, the viper waiting in the grass, saw his chance to rise. Meyer Lansky focused on expanding gambling operations. Frank Costello began consolidating political influence. Each man claimed to be honoring Luciano's legacy, but in truth they were carving it up. The empire had a pulse, but its heart was missing. Luciano had won every war except this one, the war of perception. The man who mastered invisibility had finally been seen. And in that moment of exposure, his power became mortal. Still, even in chains, Lucky Luciano remained defiant. The system had caged him, but it had not broken him. Somewhere deep in the cold corridors of Dannemora, he began plotting again, not for revenge but for survival. Because if there was one thing Lucky Luciano understood better than anyone, it was this: power is never about freedom. It's about influence. And even from behind bars, influence could still move the world. When the heavy gates of Dannemora prison closed behind Lucky Luciano in 1936, the clang echoed like the closing of an era. To the public, it was the sound of justice, the fall of America's most powerful gangster. To Luciano it was something else entirely, a change of scenery. He was no longer walking the marble floors of the Waldorf or holding meetings in smoke-filled backrooms. He was now inmate number 92168, surrounded by concrete and steel. But even in captivity, one truth remained: power adapts. Dannemora was no ordinary prison. Perched in the frozen wilderness of upstate New York, it was nicknamed Little Siberia for its brutal winters and isolation. The guards were strict, the routines rigid, and escape was nearly impossible. Yet, within weeks, Luciano began to bend the system the same way he had bent the streets. At first, he observed, watching how the guards interacted with prisoners who ran the gambling games, who controlled the smuggling of contraband cigarettes. To most inmates, prison was punishment. To Luciano it was simply another organization, one waiting to be managed. He started small, offering favors to inmates who had connections on the outside: cigarettes here, a hot meal there. His charm, always subtle, began to work its way through the walls. Within months he had built a quiet network: guards willing to pass messages, inmates acting as couriers, and contacts who funneled information back to New York. The empire might have been miles away, but Luciano's influence was still alive inside its bloodstream. On paper he was powerless. In reality he was still giving orders. Through intermediaries like Meyer Lansky and Frank Costello, Luciano continued to shape decisions within the commission. Messages smuggled out through lawyers, visitors, and coded letters ensured that his voice was still heard at the highest levels. He even managed to settle disputes between rival families from his prison cell, a feat that stunned even his enemies. What made Luciano unique wasn't just his ruthlessness, it was his psychological control. He knew how to stay relevant without appearing desperate. When reporters asked if he was still running the Mafia from prison, he simply laughed. "I can't even run the cafeteria," he said. It was a lie, of course, and everyone knew it. But it was the kind of lie that reinforced his myth. Meanwhile, outside the walls, the underworld was shifting. Frank Costello became the de facto head of the Luciano family, using his political finesse to keep the organization stable. He maintained relationships with judges, labor unions, and politicians, the same system Luciano had built years earlier. Meyer Lansky continued expanding gambling operations across Florida and Cuba, ensuring a steady flow of money. Even Vito Genovese, though untrustworthy, paid lip service to Luciano's legacy, waiting patiently for his own chance to claim the throne. Despite his control, prison was not without humiliation. Luciano had always lived in luxury: silk suits, expensive cologne, fine wine. Now his days were filled with menial labor and the smell of iron. The first winter nearly broke him. The cold seeped through the walls, and the monotony of prison life pressed down like a weight. Yet instead of surrendering, Luciano turned inward. He began reading histories, philosophy, business journals, anything he could get his hands on. He studied figures like Machiavelli and Caesar, the same leaders he had modeled his empire after. "They lost their power," he wrote to a friend, "because they stopped adapting. I won't make that mistake." His reflections gave him perspective. For the first time he wasn't orchestrating chaos, he was watching it from a distance. In that silence he began to see how his creation, the commission, had grown beyond him. It was both his masterpiece and his curse. It functioned perfectly, almost without needing him. The very efficiency he had engineered now made him replaceable. But fate, as always, had other plans. In 1942 the world outside prison walls changed again. The United States entered World War II. With the East Coast threatened by German submarines and rumors of Nazi spies infiltrating American ports, the U.S. Navy faced a terrifying vulnerability: the docks of New York Harbor. Workers were frightened, sabotage was a real fear, and the flow of supplies to Europe was at risk. The government needed control, and ironically the only man who truly controlled the docks was sitting behind bars in Dannemora. Through his old network of longshoremen and Union officials, Luciano still had influence over the very men unloading America's war supplies. That's when a quiet, almost unbelievable alliance was formed: Operation Underworld. U.S. Naval intelligence reached out to underworld contacts, specifically Meyer Lansky, Luciano's trusted lieutenant, to open negotiations. The proposition was simple but staggering. The U.S. government wanted Lucky Luciano's help. In exchange for his cooperation, there would be considerations regarding his sentence. At first, the idea sounded absurd, the government partnering with the Mafia. But desperation breeds pragmatism. Through intermediaries, Luciano agreed. From his cell, he provided names, ordered his men to protect the docks, and ensured no interference with military shipments. In exchange, he was granted improved prison conditions, better quarters, private visits, and a steady flow of information. The arrangement worked. The docks stayed secure, and the Navy credited the underworld's cooperation with preventing sabotage during critical years of the war. It was one of the strangest, most secret alliances in American history, the government's silent pact with its most notorious criminal. By the end of the war, Luciano's role in Operation Underworld became an open secret among officials. When peace returned in 1945, pressure mounted to reward him. Though the official records were sealed, influential figures, both political and criminal, began advocating for his release. Finally, in 1946, after a decade behind bars, Governor Thomas Dewey, the very man who had put Luciano there, commuted his sentence. The irony was poetic. Dewey justified it publicly as recognition for Luciano's wartime cooperation, though privately, many suspected political and underworld pressure had played a part. But there was a catch: Luciano would not walk back into his empire. Instead, he would be deported to Italy, permanently exiled from the country he had ruled from the shadows. When the guards informed him of his release, Luciano simply nodded. "Tell the warden," he said with a faint grin, "it was good while it lasted." As he left Dannemora, reporters shouted questions. Did he regret his crimes? Would he return to the Mafia? Luciano gave his signature smile and replied, "I never ran anything but my own life." It was another lie, elegant and deliberate, because even now, even as a deportee, Luciano knew he still had cards to play. For 10 years, he had ruled an empire from within a cage. Now, for the first time in a decade, the world was open again. But the world had changed, and so had he. The streets no longer belonged to one man. Power had multiplied, scattered, evolved. And as Luciano boarded the ship that would take him away from America forever, he wasn't thinking about defeat. He was thinking about survival, and about how, even in exile, influence could travel farther than presence. He had ruled the underworld from the shadows of skyscrapers. Now he would test whether power could survive without borders. When Lucky Luciano stepped off the ship in Naples in 1946, the air felt different. The noise, the chaos, the familiar hum of Italian streets, it should have felt like home. But to him it wasn't. After more than 30 years in America, Italy was no longer his world. He was a stranger in the land of his birth, an exile carrying the weight of an empire he could no longer touch. His deportation marked the end of one chapter, but not the end of his influence. The U.S. government believed it had removed a menace from American soil. What it had really done was export him. Luciano was not a man who vanished quietly. He was too calculating, too proud, and too addicted to the art of control to fade into obscurity. Italy after the war was in ruins, bombed cities, a shattered economy, and a population desperate for survival. Black markets thrived and corruption ran rampant. To a man like Luciano, this was not chaos, it was opportunity. Within weeks, he began establishing contacts with the Sicilian Mafia, men whose names echoed through dusty villages and backroom cafes. Unlike the American Mafia, the Sicilian version was older, more traditional and more secretive, still bound by local loyalties and rural power structures. They respected Luciano's reputation but viewed him as an outsider, an Americanized boss who had traded Old World honor for New World profit. Luciano, however, knew how to bridge that divide. He offered them something they lacked: access. Access to money, to trade routes, to connections that stretched from Europe to the Americas. In the late 1940s, as Europe rebuilt and trade routes reopened, Luciano began to weave together a transatlantic web of narcotics trafficking. He partnered with Corsican smugglers and Sicilian contacts to revive what would later become known as the French Connection, a heroin network moving product from Turkey to Marseille to New York. He no longer controlled the streets, but he controlled the flow. Shipments, routes, logistics, all coordinated from the shadows of Naples. To the authorities, he appeared to be living quietly, a retired businessman enjoying the sun. In reality, Luciano was building one of the most profitable underground operations in post-war Europe. Yet, there was an irony to his new existence. In America, he had been the architect of order, the commission, the rules, the discipline. In exile, he was surrounded by chaos again. The Sicilian Mafia operated differently. Impulsive, emotional, and fiercely independent. They respected Luciano, but they did not obey him. Slowly, he began to realize that the power he once wielded, the ability to impose structure and command respect across nations, could never truly be rebuilt from exile. The 1950s brought both triumph and tragedy. On one hand, Luciano's influence extended through his old allies like Meyer Lansky and Frank Costello, who continued to run American operations. Money flowed to Italy through coded bank accounts and couriers. On the other hand, new enemies were rising. Vito Genovese, once Luciano's lieutenant, now sought to dominate the New York Mafia under his own name. He portrayed himself as Luciano's true successor, the real Don. In truth, Genovese wanted to erase the shadow of his former boss. Luciano watched from afar as the organization he built began to fracture. The old unity, the corporate precision, it was slipping. The commission had become a battlefield of ambition. The structure that once kept the peace was now being used as a weapon by those hungry for control. From Naples, Luciano tried to intervene. He sent messages, arranged meetings, even summoned associates to Italy. But the Atlantic was more than a sea, it was a wall. His words carried weight but not the same authority. To many in the new generation of mobsters he was a legend, a story, not a boss. Still, Luciano refused to retire completely. He spent his days moving between Naples, Rome, and Palermo, half in the light, half in the dark. To maintain appearances, he lived modestly, residing in small apartments and hotels, never staying long in one place. The Italian police kept him under constant surveillance, suspecting his involvement in narcotics trafficking. The Americans watched too, pressured by the public to ensure he never returned. But beneath the legal pressure and political games, there was a quieter story, that of a man aging into reflection. Luciano had once believed power was about control, about bending others to his will. Now, as he looked back at his empire from across an ocean, he began to understand that power was also about impermanence. He told one journalist in a rare interview, "You can't hold the world in your hands forever. It slips through your fingers, like smoke." There were rumors, too, that Luciano longed to return to America. Not to reclaim power, but simply to die where his legend was born. He petitioned multiple times for re-entry, offering to live quietly, promising to retire. Every request was denied. The Justice Department made it clear. Lucky Luciano would never set foot in the United States again. Then came Havana, 1946 to 1947, a brief return to the spotlight. Luciano managed to travel secretly to Cuba under a false pretext, joining Lansky and other mobsters for what would become the infamous Havana Conference. It was a reunion of the old order, the dons, the gamblers, the architects of organized crime. The purpose? To discuss narcotics, territory, and the future of the syndicate. But the celebration didn't last. When the U.S. government discovered his presence in Havana, they pressured the Cuban authorities to expel him. Within weeks, Luciano was forced back to Italy. It was a moment that crystallized his reality. The world he built still operated but no longer belonged to him. The following years were quieter. Luciano's health began to fail, heart problems, exhaustion, age catching up. Friends who visited him in Naples described him as both proud and melancholy, alternating between charm and regret. "I made good men rich," he once said. "I made bad men kings. But I never learned to make peace." In his final years he tried to live a semblance of normalcy. He frequented cafes, visited old friends, and even considered writing his memoirs. But the past had a way of finding him. Authorities still shadowed him, journalists still whispered his name, and rivals still debated whether he was truly finished. On January 26, 1962, Luciano met with an Italian film producer at Naples airport. The producer had promised to make a movie about his life, a chance for Luciano to tell his story his way to reclaim his myth. But as they shook hands on the tarmac, Luciano suddenly collapsed. A massive heart attack stopped him mid-sentence. He died instantly, not in a mansion, not surrounded by his empire, but alone on a cold airport runway, his hat rolling across the concrete. When police searched his body, they found a few personal items: a rosary, a small notebook, and the last of his pocket change. The man who had once controlled millions died with almost nothing. Yet his funeral, days later in Naples, was attended by hundreds, friends, enemies, admirers, and police alike. Even in death he commanded fascination. They say he wanted his body returned to America, and in a final twist of irony the government allowed it. His coffin was shipped to New York, the city he once ruled, the streets that once echoed his orders. As the casket was lowered into the ground, one observer remarked, "He built an empire from nothing. And in the end he took it all with him, not the money, not the power, but the legend." Lucky Luciano had outlived every rival, every prosecutor, every system that tried to cage him. His end was not one of defeat but of inevitability, the final act of a man who had always known that control, like life itself, is temporary. History has a way of polishing its villains, turning them into something more than they were: symbols, myths, warnings. Lucky Luciano was no exception. When the dust settled on his life, when the newspapers stopped chasing his ghost and the FBI files gathered dust, what remained wasn't just the story of a gangster. It was the story of a system, a philosophy of control that outlived its creator. In the years following his death in 1962, organized crime in America, and beyond, continued to function with the precision of the structure he built. The Commission, his greatest invention, remained the governing body of the American Mafia for decades. Meetings were still held, territories were still negotiated, and disputes were still settled through the framework Luciano had designed 3 decades earlier. He had given the underworld something it had never possessed before: stability. Before Luciano, the Mafia had been a tangle of clans and vendettas. Power was measured by bullets and bloodlines. After Luciano, it became something closer to a corporation, complete with hierarchy, strategy, and accountability. He had taken the primal chaos of crime and forged it into an institution. That institutional mindset spread far beyond the Italian-American Mafia. The organizational principles he established, division of labor, central oversight, and shared profit models, were studied by other criminal groups worldwide. From the Yakuza in Japan to the cartels in Latin America, Luciano's influence seeped into the DNA of organized crime. The idea that a criminal enterprise could mimic legitimate business, operating with discipline and long-term planning, all traced back to his blueprint. But Luciano's legacy wasn't confined to crime alone. His story became a mirror reflecting the contradictions of the American dream. Here was a man who embodied its most seductive promise: to rise from nothing, to make yourself powerful, to bend the world to your will. Yet his path revealed the darker side of that dream, that in a system built on competition and ambition, morality was often an obstacle, not a guide. Luciano didn't invent corruption. He simply understood it better than anyone. He saw that power wasn't earned through violence alone, but through exchange. Money for loyalty. Silence for protection. Favors for influence. He understood that every man, cop, politician, or gangster, had a price. In a sense, he didn't corrupt the system. He learned to speak its language fluently. Even decades later, law enforcement agencies would admit, sometimes grudgingly, that Luciano's methods changed the way they fought crime. The FBI's entire strategy for organized crime in the 1960s and 70s was built as a response to his legacy. The RICO Act, the concept of criminal enterprise charges, the targeting of leadership hierarchies, all of it emerged because Luciano had proven that crime could be managed like a multinational corporation. To destroy the Mafia, authorities first had to understand how he had built it. In the cultural imagination, Luciano became something else entirely: an icon of calculated control. Hollywood found endless fascination in his story. Characters like Michael Corleone in The Godfather and Tony Montana in Scarface were shaped, in part, by his psychological profile: the man who blended intellect with ruthlessness, the criminal who believed in rules. Luciano's calm demeanor, his insistence on structure over chaos, his cold detachment from violence. These traits became cinematic archetypes for generations of antiheroes. But beneath the glamour, there was always the haunting paradox. The man who built order out of crime eventually lost control of his own creation. The very system that made him untouchable also made him unnecessary. Once the commission could operate without him, his empire no longer needed its founder. It was a kind of poetic irony. Luciano had built a machine so efficient that it outlived him, but in doing so, it erased his own relevance. Still, his fingerprints lingered everywhere. Even in exile, the policies and alliances he created shaped global narcotics routes, money laundering methods, and cross-border criminal coordination for decades. His partnership model, where different ethnic groups could cooperate rather than compete, laid the groundwork for the internationalization of organized crime. Yet, to understand Luciano fully, one must go beyond the empire and look into the psychology of the man himself. He was not driven by cruelty or ideology, but by a craving for control. His entire life, from the tenement streets of Manhattan to the gilded halls of the Waldorf, was a study in domination, of others, of chaos, of his own fate. He once told an associate, "You can't run a racket if you don't understand people. You don't need to love them, you just need to know what they want." That philosophy wasn't about empathy, it was about manipulation as strategy. Luciano's genius was psychological as much as logistical. He could read a man's weakness in a conversation, see betrayal coming from the tone of a sentence, sense opportunity in silence. That instinct, to understand before controlling, is what separated him from his peers. Most mobsters thought like soldiers. Luciano thought like a CEO. He didn't need to pull the trigger, he just needed to design the conditions that made someone else do it. That's the essence of what he left behind, the art of indirect control, the architecture of influence. There's also a certain philosophical tragedy to his story. For all his power, Luciano never achieved peace. He conquered fear, wealth, respect. Yet in the end he was a man exiled from the only place that mattered to him. America had been both his kingdom and his mirror, reflecting his brilliance and his flaws in equal measure. When it cast him out, he lost not just his empire but the identity that defined him. Still, the irony runs deep. In death he achieved the immortality he could never grasp in life. His name became legend, whispered in the same breath as Al Capone and Meyer Lansky, studied by criminologists, dramatized by filmmakers, envied by successors. His rules of power became unwritten commandments for every aspiring boss. Build systems, not chaos. Keep business and violence separate. Control through fear but lead through respect. Never show emotion, it's the enemy of control. And above all, disappear behind the structure. Those rules didn't just define his world, they defined the DNA of modern organized crime. Every mob family, every cartel, every underground network operating with structure and secrecy owes a silent debt to Luciano's design. But his true legacy lies in the deeper question his life raises: can power ever be pure? Luciano proved that control can be absolute, but it always comes at the cost of the soul that wields it. He showed that the architecture of power, whether in crime or politics, follows the same laws. Build too tightly and it suffocates, let go too soon and it collapses. In the end, Lucky Luciano's greatest creation wasn't the commission, or his empire, or even the myths surrounding his name. His greatest creation was the idea that control, organized, rational, emotionless control, could turn even chaos into order. That idea didn't die with him. It still breathes in boardrooms and backrooms alike, wherever men trade morality for ambition, wherever systems are built on silence, loyalty, and fear. Luciano may have been buried in Queens, but his shadow still stretches far beyond the grave. Not as a criminal, but as a master of the one art humanity never stops practicing: the art of control. Lucky Luciano's story does not end with his death, it ends with the question his life still asks: what does it mean to control? His empire has faded, his allies turned to dust, but his principles, order, discipline, strategy, live on in every system built on power and secrecy. He was more than a gangster, he was an architect of influence. Luciano's genius was not violence, but vision. His ability to transform chaos into hierarchy and greed into a form of governance. Yet that same control became his curse. The tighter he held the world in his grasp, the more he lost his humanity. His rise mirrors the American dream: ruthless ambition, relentless innovation, and the illusion that power equals freedom. But his fall reminds us of the truth: control isolates. It demands loyalty but gives none in return. It builds empires but it destroys the soul. In the end, Luciano died far from the city he conquered, a man surrounded not by soldiers but by silence. He had mastered the game but not himself. And that is his lasting legacy, the warning that every empire, no matter how perfectly designed, eventually consumes its creator. Lucky Luciano changed how the world understood crime, and how it understood power. His life is a blueprint, his myth a mirror, his end a lesson. In every age and every structure of dominance, his ghost whispers the same truth: control is never permanent. Power is never personal. And the cost of mastery is always everything.